Thank you everyone for joining this session today. This is Data-Driven Design Systems in Practice. I'm Patrick, your host, and also the product manager for Omelet. Earlier this morning, Palian, our co-founder and CEO, made the announcement of the launch of our new product, Omelet, which is now in public beta. And for those of you who didn't catch that session, Omelet is a component analytics tool built for front-end teams working on design systems. And joining us today, we have also Hoshki, who is a design system engineer at Optimizely and also an early user of Omelet. So like the title of this session suggests, we're going to be learning from Hoshki some of the challenges and problems that he's tackling in the design system at Optimizely. And also, we're going to be talking about how he's actually using Omelet in action through a live walkthrough. So I'm very excited to kickstart this session. But first off, welcome, Hoshki. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. And how is your day today so far?
Doing good. Just have a little throat condition.
Yeah, but your voice sounds great. So first off, to kickstart it, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your personal journey and a little bit about yourself for the audience. One coincidence I learned is that we actually both moved from Japan to the US earlier in our life. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that story from you.
Sure. Yeah, I moved to the US when I was 19 to study music. And after the school, I got the job at the online music retail store. And I was responsible for updating the web page there. And that was my intro to the web dev. And a couple years later, the store closed, but I decided to pursue the developer career. So I studied programming. And at my previous job, I worked with UX designer and learned what designers do. And I also learned about the design systems. And it felt very natural to me to be in that in-between layer of designers and developers. And that experience made me interested in working on the design systems as an engineer.
Yeah, that's a great story. And also, it's interesting, maybe your musical talent and interest translating to your interest in design systems. So we learned a little bit about yourself. The next thing I wanted to learn a little bit about also is the design system that you're working on at Optimizely. Can you tell us a little bit about the history and also the team that's working behind that?
Yeah, sure. The Optimizely design system is called Axiom, and it changed the name in the past, but it's been around for 5-6 years, maybe longer. And my team is consistent of 4 people and 3 developers and 1 designer. And we are a fully remote team and located all over the world. And we are quite new team too. Our first hire was a staff developer back in April last year. And I joined as a last member in end of July.
Nice. Yeah. So it's a pretty long-standing design system, new team. Sure, so there's some interesting challenges there. So let's talk a little bit about that as well. So what were some maybe the challenges and problems that you're experiencing that kind of triggered you to look for Omelet? And maybe before you kind of share your experience, I'll also like to share some of the observations and things that I heard from teams after talking to a lot of design system teams. I've spoken to folks from GitHub, Segment, Prog4, Amplitude, and many other teams. And there are a couple of themes I heard. So one of them is around measuring adoption, tracking success of the design system itself. The second piece is actually getting into the nitty-gritty details and learning about how those components are used and using that information to actually make decisions on how to improve those components, how to update them. And the last piece is once you actually, let's say, launch those releases and changes to the components, can you tell if those actually made a difference to your design system? Did it actually move the needle? So those are some areas that I've heard from my conversations. I'd love to hear if there's some overlaps with your experience and the challenges that you actually try and tackle there. So can you share a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So Optimizely, they have 2 design systems. One is Axiom that I work on, and there's another one from pre-acquisition time too. And we encourage teams to start using Axiom components, but there are products that are using auto component in some of the products. So we wanted a way to identify those older components in more automated way, so that we don't have to go through it manually. And also, since we are a very new team, we were not fully aware of what's happening in the code base. So we were worried about, the side effect that could happen by updating one component. And while I was doing research on the solution to, handle all those issues, I learned about Omelet.
Yeah, so it makes sense. I think that maybe kind of overlaps with the second use case we were talking about around understanding really where components are actually being used, and then using that information to make decisions around how do you streamline the components that you have available. So I think that gives some great context for the folks to understand like, what are the ways that you're going to be using Omelet. So let's dive into actually the live walkthrough. And to get started, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do a demo of actually how to use Omelet to scan a repository first. And I'm going to be using a open source project for that. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay, so the open source project that we're going to be using today is Proton, which is a privacy-focused suite of applications. It has, for example, an email client, calendar, VPN, file storage. And I've already had that downloaded here. And we're going to be using the Omelet CLI to actually scan that repository. And the CLI itself, you can actually install it from NPM. And I already have that also installed as well. So all I need to do now is just run the Omelet analyze command. So once I run that, it's going to actually start scanning this project. It's going to detect all the components that are defined in this project, all the ways in it's actually used in this project, as well as its dependencies. And it's going to collect all that information and upload it to the Omelet web application. And there we can actually analyze that information. Okay, so now that the analysis is done, let's actually move to a dashboard to look at the results. So before we go into the details, one thing I wanted to ask you, Hoshiki, is your initial experience. Are there any things that you've noted or you like to highlight here as well?
Yeah, I really liked how easy it is to set it up. All you have to do is just install it globally and then run the analyze command in the terminal. And it gives you this URL that takes you to this dashboard UI. And this dashboard UI is very helpful when communicating this information to the stakeholders. Yeah, other tools I was using was more like text-based data. So while it has like great information, it was harder to communicate that. So
yeah, it's good to hear that like the visualization helps with communicating with other stakeholders. Also the ease of use of setup, like that's something that we focused on as well. So I'm glad to hear that you experienced that. So let's go into actually some of the use cases, like ways that you're actually using Omelet to solve some of the problems that we were talking about earlier. One of the things that we mentioned about was around measuring adoption, tracking that. I'd love for you to share like what are some of the areas in Omelet you're using that to get some of those information and insights.
Sure. So there are two areas that Omelet shows me the component adoption. One is component adoption over time. And with other solution that I might get the snapshot of how adoption looked like at one point in time, but it was harder to get the trend line view, like how the adoption went from release to release and stuff. And that's where Omelet helps. And the second one is a component usage by project. And when I showed this view to our designer, she mentioned this could serve nicely as a kind of like a adoption scoreboard. So it gives visibility to current adoption progress and encourage teams to use Axiom more.
Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, you're tracking the adoption over time with the chart there, and then also looking at the adoption over each team and giving that information to the other teams that are using the design system. I think those are great examples. So let's move on to the next use case. So you were talking about earlier in your challenges that you have two component libraries. One of them is the current one, Axiom Design System component. And then the next one is also the one that came from the acquisition. And you were trying to merge and streamline those two component libraries. So could you go into a little bit more detail and like what are you trying to do there? And then how are you using Omelet to solve that?
Sure. Yeah. For that, why don't I share my screen so I can show you how I'm using it? Okay. So yeah. Just like you said, we have two design systems in our products, and some of them have the same name and very similar features. So like on this list, there are two typography components there already, and I know for the fact there are duplicate checkbox and duplicate buttons and stuff. And those custom components should be replaced with Axiom components. And our current task is about updating, improving the layout of the products. So we need to know if the product uses the grid components, and if they are using it, is it Axiom component or legacy component? And if they're using a custom components, we can learn how it behaves and try to adapt those missing features to Axiom component. And for that, we can just search for the grid component here. And from this list, you can already see there are custom grid and core component grid, which comes from Axiom. And This tells me there are two subcomponents to the grid component, and which are grid row and grid cell, and those should be in consideration when we adapt to the Axiom 2. So identifying the component is one thing, and then also we can go into the detail view by clicking into one of them, and it gives me this tree view. And this tree view is very good visualization of how the relationship between the components. And from this, I can see if I update this grid component, it could have some impact to all these three components, and eventually it would affect the entire app. This information makes me confident on that we can update the component and having them use it instead.
So it sounds like, yeah, using this information to look at how the component's actually being used and then making changes to components. So that's a great use case. The other thing that you briefly touched on is that you're able to detect other similar looking components that you might not be aware about. So could you also talk us about a little bit about how you're using Alma to find those out?
Sure. Yeah. For that, let me click the search. I'll just filter out the custom components and look at the number of the times it's being used. And this information is very helpful to decide which one to prioritize for adoption. So if it's used more, that should be the priority items.
I see. So you're filtering to custom components, and that can show up all the similar looking components and then prioritizing those by frequency of use. That totally makes sense. The last use case is you mentioned a little bit about actually upgrading to a newer version of React. And that was an interesting kind of story. I would like for you to go a little bit more in detail on what you're trying to do there, and then how you are using Alma for that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So we are trying to move from React 16 to 18 to support the newer products that use newer version of React, or using the React-based frameworks. And instead of updating React version of existing Axiom as a kind of an experiment, we are making a new package that supports React 17 and up. And by filtering just the core components, we can see which one is being used more, and those should be prioritized to be added to the new package.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so you're prioritizing the ones that are being used most frequently, and then adding those to the new library. That way you can actually drive adoption for those folks using the new version of React. So I think that's a great use case as well. So we covered a couple of examples already. So we covered measuring adoption as one of the things. Talked about how do you actually make decisions about updating a component through the dependency tree that Hoshiki mentioned about, detecting similar looking components using the filters that we have, and also how do you actually migrate to a new version of a component library by prioritizing the usage of the component. So hopefully that's useful for everyone listening on how to actually take advantage of Alma and using data to improve your design system. The next thing I'm curious to ask Hoshiki is, you've been using Alma for a while. So I would like to learn from you. Do you have any kind of wish list items for us, or any feature requests that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, the GitHub integration would be great because we have so many repos and to scan. So if we could automate that scanning process, it would save us a lot of time. And also tracking the prop usage would be very helpful too. So we can learn how teams are using those components. And with that information, we can decide what kind of improvements to make on the components.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. You know, I heard from my conversations that people have dozens, hundreds, or even over 1,000 of repositories. So I can see how that can be challenging to track all the design system usage across that many repositories. Definitely something that we have on our radar. Prop usage, like you mentioned, is something that we heard from a lot of teams. I heard that people are tracking that information to decide if props could be deprecated if they're not being used a lot, or if unusual values are being passed, then that could be a signal that those design system components aren't supporting the specific use cases that individual developers have. So again, an interesting use case that I have in my mind as well.
Yeah, and also I was curious what's on the roadmap of the Omelet's future releases.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in the near term, our priority is to make sure we're providing visibility for component adoption, and then helping you make decisions about how to improve your design system and your components. So for that purpose, some things that we're thinking about are, for example, looking at supporting design tokens, since that's a crucial part of a design system. and also framework support as well, since we know that there are other frameworks that people are using, or in some cases, some teams are using multiple frameworks within a company. So something that we are also having consideration. And then looking a little bit down in the future, another thing that we're thinking about is how do we improve the individual developers' experience using design system? How do we make it easier for them to use a design system? And then also, if there are challenges using a design system, how do we make sure that they can easily funnel that feedback up to the folks that are actually building and maintaining the design system? That's also something that we're thinking about as well. So hopefully that excites you, Hoshki, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of glimpse for the audience as well and what we're looking to do with the Omelet.
Yeah, that all sounds like a great features. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground already. We talked about the ways that you're using Omelet in action, Hoshki, and also a little bit about the future of Omelet. I think we're towards the end of the session, but before we wrap up, any final words for you, Hoshki, that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, just to plug in like some of my stuff, but Optimize is hiring for 2 designers positions, one in the UK and one in the US. So those information can be found on the careers page. And I have a very niche podcast. It's called Design System Chat. We talk about design system engineering in Japanese. So if any of the viewers happen to speak Japanese, they might find it interesting.
Well, I'm going to be sharing this session with my Japanese friends, and I can speak Japanese and listen Japanese, so I'll definitely check it out. For the listeners, please check out Hoshki's podcast.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about, the omelette and why it's called omelette.
It's an interesting background story. So originally our founders, when they were building Zeppelin, that was actually one of the candidate names. They had a few names for what was going to be Zeppelin's name for the product. And Omelet was actually one of them. There's a couple other things. I think what they were thinking about is something that they can translate both. It sounds well both in English and Turkish. So Omelet is a word that can be used in Turkish, and Zeppelin's another one. They finally chose Zeppelin, but Omelet was one of the candidates. And so this is a new product, so we decided to use Omelet.
The launching product is always, there's always difficulties. And I'm curious what kind of issues you had launching Omelet.
Yeah, so I think maybe there's like 2 things I mentioned there. So one of them is when we first started thinking about Omelet, we wanted to build something that's useful for front-end developers. So thinking about how do we make it so that they can start using it without any dependencies, making sure that they can initiate and use a product. That was one thing that we always thought about when we were thinking about this product. And the second piece is also web is such a diverse ecosystem, and then supporting all the different frameworks and the ways that people set up their projects. That was another challenge that we were aware about, and we were thinking about a lot and deeply to make sure we can cover all those use cases, and something that we continue to improve on. So earlier in the product development stages that we were thinking about, and hopefully we've been making improvements to make sure that those 2 places we are like covering those.
Are there specific frameworks you're thinking of supporting?
Yeah, so we started with React since that has like a very big market share, but obviously there are other frameworks like Angular, Vue. We've started to hear about like web components as well, so potentially that as well. Those are kind of like the top candidates that we're thinking about. And then obviously there's the mobile side, so React Native, relatively close cousin to React, so potentially that could be an easy way to support it. And then down the road, probably into native mobile as well.
Nice. Yeah, Optimize, they have a web components initiative right now, so supporting web components would be great.
Well, it was great having you here, and thank you everyone for listening till the end of this session. I definitely recommend everyone visiting omelet.dev to sign up for Omelet and try it out. We are always looking for feedback, and we are also continuously improving the product as well, so definitely reach out to us. And finally, thank you again, Hoshki, for joining us. Thank you everyone for listening, and please look out for more updates on Omelet.